Welcome to my comprehensive guide on how to emulate almost every Ace Combat game on PC. In this series of videos, I'll be covering everything you need to know, from which emulators to use, how to set up these emulators, the files, fixes, and cheats needed to address emulation issues related to Ace Combat, as well as some of the best and recommended settings for each game. All the necessary links will be in the video description, as well as links to some of the materials I've referenced to make these guides. Note that due to some legal issues surrounding emulation, I will not be able to provide nor directly link to some of the critical files needed for these emulators to function. Don't worry though, I will provide some guidance as to where you can find these files yourself. It really isn't too difficult. In this first part of my full Ace Combat emulation guide, I'll be covering the 3 original Ace Combat games released for PlayStation 1. Air Combat, also known as Ace Combat in Japan, Ace Combat 2, as well as Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere. Note that with Ace Combat 3, this guide will be focusing on its Japanese version, as it's the overall better version of the game with a fully voice-acted story with multiple story paths as well as cutscenes. The international export versions of Ace Combat 3, released in the European and US markets, will follow mostly the same setup as Ace Combat 2 and Air Combat. And with all that out of the way, let's get started.
Ready? Break now!
The emulator we'll be using is Duckstation. It's one of the newer emulators on the block, and is one of the better emulators to use for PlayStation 1 games currently. It runs well, is simple to set up, and has newer features like PGXP support, which helps to reduce some of the weird and warping graphics and textures you usually see when emulating PlayStation 1 games. First, click the link in the video description labeled Download Emulator. This will take you to Duckstation's release page, where you'll be able to download the emulator. If you scroll down, you'll see a bunch of different files. This guide mainly focuses on emulating on Windows PCs, so for the sake of this guide, we'll be downloading Duckstation Windows 64 release.zip. Just click on the link and you'll be able to download the file. Also, if you want to read up on any information about Duckstation, you can just scroll up and click on this link here, and this will take you to the main page where you can then scroll down and you'll find the readme that details about everything you'd want to know about Duckstation. After you finish downloading the emulator, put the file somewhere where you'll have a bit of space, because the file we'll be creating is gonna get relatively big, about 20 to 50 gigs depending, at maximum. That's like worst case scenario. So if you have maybe multiple drives and you have a bigger drive, rather place it there. When you're there, right click and then just make a new folder called Ace Combat Emulation. And inside of this folder, create another folder called PlayStation 1. In the later guides, we're also going to be making a PlayStation 2 folder, an Xbox 360 folder, a PSP one, and so on. So it's just to keep it a bit more organized. Drag the Duckstation emulator that you downloaded into this folder. Then right click it and extract it to its own folder using either Windows' built-in extractor tool, 7-zip, or WinRAR. This is a standard zip file, so it doesn't matter which one you use. And there you go. Next, we need to get the PlayStation 1 BIOS files. Sadly, this is one of those things I can't directly link to. What I recommend, however, is doing the following. Check in the video description, there's a link to this emulation guide for Duckstation. There's a section called Setting Up the BIOS. It'll tell you more about how you can find and get the BIOS file that you need. Also, side note, this is the emulation guide that I'm basing my video guide off of. So, if you want a more general Duckstation emulation guide, or just prefer a written format, definitely check this one out. It features everything you need to know about Duckstation emulation, explaining all of the different settings and what they do and how they can affect the game. Alright, just pause the video here and just go to this guide and then get the BIOS file. If you already have the BIOS file, then, well, we can move on. Alright, now that you have the BIOS file, we can continue. Alright, so just drag this into the PlayStation 1 folder, and then extract it to its own folder, similar like how we did it with the emulator. In the folder, you should see a file that looks like this, scph4numbers.bin. I don't think it really matters which specific version of the BIOS you use, but the 1001 BIOS seems to pretty much work everywhere. There might be some weird use case where you need like a specific BIOS file for a specific set of games, but with PlayStation 1 emulation, I haven't really run into that issue, so I don't think it's really something to worry about. Alright, and with all that done, we can start setting up the emulator. Go into the emulators folder, and then you can launch it with this executable file. Just double click it. And if Windows pops up with this, you can just click more info and run anyway. Usually Windows tries to protect you from running random executable files that it doesn't trust, but you don't have to worry, there's nothing wrong with this. So just click run anyway. And there you go. Also to note, when you launch the emulator for the first time, it'll create a folder under Documents called Duckstation. This is where it'll be saving all of its settings, as well as the memory cards. So just to note, if you need to move things over to another computer, this is where your game saves will be.
Office 1, ball, tag me in.
In this section of the video, we're going to start inputting the settings into the emulator to get it ready to run the games. Click the settings button at the top right, and then go to BIOS settings. Go here to this Open in Explorer button. This will take you to the folder where you need to place the BIOS file. And all you do is just drag it over or copy it over, move it over or whatever. And there you go, you can just close this then. To test the BIOS, you can close the settings and click on this button. And there you go, now you know the BIOS actually works. You can just press this button to turn the emulator off and go back to settings. Next, we're going to set up our controllers. I personally use an Xbox One controller, but this emulator should work perfectly fine with any X input type controller. For example, a DualShock 4 controller using DS4 Windows gets picked up as an Xbox One controller anyways. So you just head over to controller settings. First off, go up to controller type and select analog controller DualShock. That'll allow you to use the analog sticks. Then you can quickly check down here at load profile to see if one of your controllers may be here. In my case, I'll just use the Xbox controller and everything has already been set. There may be the case where if you set this, it might not work out of the box. Usually this is because you might have more than one controller plugged in, and the controller you actually want to use might be controller 1 or controller 2 instead of controller 0. In this case, it might be better to manually assign them. So all you do is you click on the button, and then you click the corresponding button on the controller. There you go. Click the down directional pad, left, right, and so on. Just a note with the axis bindings, left X means moving the left analog stick left or right, and left Y means moving the left analog stick up or down. Same applies for the right analog stick, X is side to side, and right Y is up or down on the right stick. It may also be worth noting, if you've played one of the newer Ace Combat games, it might be better to swap around the L1, L2, R1 and R2 buttons. So you can rather use the triggers for throttles and the shoulder buttons for your control. Otherwise, leave a default for the original controls. But in my case, I'm gonna make L1 actually work as L2. I'm gonna make L2 L1. R1 I'll make R2, which is a trigger. and R2 I'll make R1, which is the shoulder buttons. That's just the way I prefer it. I find it more comfortable that way, just through muscle memory from playing some of the newer games. Also, if you're assigning the buttons manually, and you want to assign the rumble or the shake function to the controller, just click on it and press any button on the controller. Most of the, I think the analog sticks might not pick up, but every other button should pick up. I'd also recommend scrolling down a bit further and checking the use analog sticks for D-pad in digital mode. This will help out with the first two Ace Combat games, as they came out before analog sticks on a PlayStation controller were even a thing, and they used the D-pad to actually control the plane. This will make it so that you can use the analog sticks in place of the D-pad, but if you want to, you can still use the D-pad to play. Also, set the analog access scale to about 1,3 or 1,4 for modern controllers like the Xbox One controller as well as the DualShock 4 controller. For example, I've set mine to 1.35, so splitting the difference between the two. And that's it, your controller should be completely assigned and working perfectly with the emulator. Now we can move on. Next, under display settings, head to adapter. If you have a dedicated graphics card, select it here. That's just to ensure that the emulator uses your graphics card instead of any integrated graphics, just to get better performance. Change the hardware renderer to Vulkan as well. Vulkan tends to have a bit better performance, but if you're not too sure, keep it at D3, D11, it'll be perfectly fine. Also, if you encounter any screen tearing while you're playing games, for example where the one image is drawn over the other image and it causes a horizontal moving line across the screen that kind of looks like a tear, definitely enable VSync because that should sort it out. Otherwise, leave it disabled. Also, the emulator tends to show you a lot of messages every time it does something like save to a memory card and so on. If you don't want these messages, just enable this show OSD messages checkbox here. And last but not least, we'll do the enhancement settings. It will make the games look super nice and super sharp. First off, we'll set the internal resolution scale. What this multiplier does is it takes the original resolution of the game and multiplies it to a higher resolution, making the game look a lot sharper. Usually it's a good idea to just set it to a multiplier that matches the resolution of your monitor for 4K, 1440p, 1080p and so on. You can set it higher and it can increase the sharpness of the game a little bit. Do note though, the higher the multiplication, the more demanding the game will be to run. So if a game has a lot of slowdowns or freezes or stutters, this is definitely the first setting you'd have to reduce to get some of that performance back and to get the game running smooth. For the sake of this guide, I'm just going to put it to 5x. Next, we can set texture filtering. One of the problems that comes with increasing the resolution of the game is that the original textures don't also really increase with the resolution, and they were also never meant to be shown at such a high resolution, so they do tend to look very blurry and pixelated. What texture filtering aims to do is improve the look of these pixelated textures. Play around with these 4 settings: nearest neighbor, bilinear, JINC2 and XBR to see which one works the best for you, or even looks the best for you. Nearest neighbor is the closest to the original textures as possible, so they do tend to look very blocky and pixelated, but it is true to the original textures. Bilinear applies a blur filter over the textures to make them look a little bit nicer and less pixelated than they'd look with nearest neighbor. It doesn't look super good, but it's not very performance intensive either. So it's a good option to use if you're running into performance issues like game slowdowns and so on. XPR smooths out the textures quite a bit and in some cases can make them look very smudgy. It's also one of the more performance intensive texture filtering options. And lastly we have JINC2, the one that I usually use. It's kind of in between bilinear filtering and XPR filtering. It's not as pixelated as bilinear, but it's also not as smudgy as XPR. And it's also not as performance intensive as XPR either, so it's a good middle ground between the two. But definitely play with these 4 settings and see which one you prefer the look of. Next, we can check the chroma smoothing option. This should reduce the blockiness in some of the cutscene videos and so on. It doesn't have that much of a difference, but it does help out a little bit. And next, check the geometry correction setting here, as well as the preserve projection precision. This is that PGXP setting I mentioned earlier that'll help reduce the wavy and warpy textures and graphics of older PlayStation 1 games, massively improving the look of the game. And alright, that's it for setting up the emulator to run the games. Now I'll show you different ways to get the games into the emulator so you can start playing them.
Clear to engage.
Before we continue with this section, I'd like to recommend that you turn on file extensions in Windows Explorer. Some of the game files will have the same name, but be of different file types, and if it doesn't display all the file types, well then it might just get a little bit confusing. So all you have to do is go up to View, and then click on File Name Extensions. And that way it will show all of the different extensions for the files, so you can now distinguish between the bin and the Q files. And with that out of the way, let's continue. In this section of the guide, I'll be explaining a couple of different methods on how to get the games onto your computer to use with the emulator. I recommend using the NTSC or USA releases of Air Combat and Ace Combat 2, as they'll be running at 60 FPS versus the European or PAL versions that ran at 50 FPS. Technically, it's more to do with hertz and the refresh rate of monitors and TVs in the different regions, but that's a complete different topic. Also, for Ace Combat 3, I highly recommend getting the Japanese version of the game, for reasons that I've already mentioned in the intro of this video. It consists of about 52 missions, split over 2 discs, with dialogue, cutscenes, and a bunch of extra stuff. It is just overall the better version of the game compared to its international US and European releases. Also, it runs in 60 FPS just like the NTSC versions of Ace Combat 2 and Air Combat. Some of the methods of obtaining the games are sadly less legal than others, so time for a disclaimer. I do not condone piracy or video game piracy of any kind. However, some of these games are over 20 years old. They are difficult to find, especially in playable or even good condition. They might not have been sold much in your region, or your region didn't receive the proper version of the game for the emulator, the NTSC version and so on. While I don't condone video game piracy, I do however support the idea of video game preservation, to keep these games alive and playable for future generations so they'll never be forgotten. Ideally, you should own the physical copies of the games, but I understand that that's not really a feasible option for every single person. The first method is to rip the game files from the discs yourself to be able to place them on the computer. The other method is to use an internet archive where someone else has already ripped the game files and placed them on the internet archive to allow other people to access it. I'll explain both as best as I can. The first method is to rip the game files from the discs yourself. This is the most legal way of doing it. However, you will need to physically have the game discs, as well as have access to a CD or a DVD drive to actually perform the process. I don't actually have too much experience with this. Actually, I don't even have access to a CD or a DVD drive right now to actually demonstrate the process. What I've done instead is place a link in the video description to a video by Tech James where he describes how to use a program called Image Burn and use it to rip game files from PlayStation 1 discs to your computer. Once you've finished watching the video and you've already ripped all the game files from the discs, make a folder called Games next to the Emulators folder and place each game into its own individual folder just to keep things a little bit more organized. Each folder should look something like this: a bin and a Q file, a bin and a Q file, and so on. Except for Air Combat, where it has a bunch of bin files most likely and one Q file. Now that you've finished ripping the game files from the discs and place them in their proper folders, you can now skip to this timestamp to continue with the rest of the guide. If you couldn't make use of this method, don't worry though, just keep watching. Let's say you don't currently have access to a CD or DVD drive to rip the game files yourself, or you might not even have direct access to your own physical copies of the games at the moment. Maybe you don't want to put any scratches or extra scratches onto the discs, or you'd prefer to just play the NTSC version over the version that you have just for that better 60 FPS experience. If you fall into one of these scenarios, well, there is another way to get the games. In this method, you'll be downloading them from some internet archive where someone has uploaded the game files for preservation purposes. I'm just going to say this again, I highly recommend that you actually own the games yourself. Do not do this if you don't own the games, because it is technically considered piracy and is technically illegal. There's no real way I can enforce this, but I kinda just have to say it. Sadly, I can't tell you exactly where to go to download the game files, but what I can do, however, is give you a couple of hints to guide you in kind of the right direction that's also relatively safe. First off, Google r/ROMs. It's a community on Reddit dedicated to discussing and helping people with retro video game ROMs and game files. They have a mega thread with a bunch of information of where you may or may not be able to find the games. Remember that while you're looking for the games, make sure that you get the USA releases of Air Combat and Ace Combat 2 and the Japanese version of Ace Combat 3. You may also notice that there may be two different versions of Ace Combat 3's Japanese version, a normal one and one that is labeled Revision 1. I don't think it really matters in the grand scheme of things which one you get. The translation patch will work with both versions of the game, but rather just to be safe, get the Revision 1 if you can. Once you've finished downloading all of the game files, place them in the games folder that we made earlier. Then, extract each one to its own folder using the appropriate software. In my case, it's all standard zip files, so it doesn't really matter what I use, but I'll just use 7-zip to just extract them all at the same time. And there you go. When it's done, you can then delete these zip files or place them somewhere safe if you ever need them again. And you'll be left with a couple of folders, one for each game, except for Ace Combat 3 where you will have a folder for each disc. And inside, you'll see a bin file and a Q file. Bin file and a Q file. And for Air Combat, it has a bunch of bin files and one Q file. Now that you have all the games, either through the first or the second method, we're almost done. There is one more thing to do, however. If you're not planning on playing Ace Combat 3's Japanese version, then skip to this timestamp. If you do plan on playing the Japanese version of Ace Combat 3, then just keep watching, because now we'll be applying the English translation patch to the game.
Update target.
The wonderful people over at Project Nemo spent years translating all of the story-related text in Ace Combat 3 so that the rest of the world outside of Japan can also experience it. First, we need to download the files and the program that we need to use to patch the translation into the game. Just head over to Project Nemo's website and download the compressed file with this link. The link to the website will be in the video description. Do note that you will need WinRAR to extract the tool. Link to WinRAR's download page will be in the video description. Once you finish downloading the patching utility, and you've also installed WinRAR if you haven't already yet, then we can continue. Take the compressed file that we downloaded, right click on it, and then use the extract here option with WinRAR. Now you can open the file that we just extracted, and then go into the patching utility folder, and then run the delta patcher lite.exe file. put the patcher off to one side, and then go to the patching utility folder and go one back. First, you'll be translating the first disk. Go to where Ace Combat 3's first disk files are, look for the bin file, and then drag that onto the left side of the utility until it says move, and then just let go. Then, go to the patching utilities folder, go to disk 1, and drag over the file also onto the left side of the patching utility, and then let go. Then press apply patch. And alright, the first disk has been translated. Now you just do the same for the second disk. Go to the second disk's folder, get the bin file, and drag that over onto the left side of the utility. Then go to the patching utilities folder, go to the second disk's folder, and then drag over the file to the left side of the patching utility, and press apply patch. And there you go. We've just translated the entire game to English.
Entering Electrosphere.
We've reached the final section of this guide, where we'll be adding the games to Duckstation's game list, just to make it easier to launch the games each time. First, click on the settings button at the top right, and then go to the game list settings here on the left. Then, click on the plus icon at the top right next to search directories. And then navigate to the folder where you have your games. So like this. Select the folder, so the entire folder, and then when it prompts you with this, just click yes. This will just ensure that it will properly find all the games even though they're placed in their own individual folders. And that's pretty much it. You can then close the settings menu and you should see the games pop up here in the game list. Hey, so before we continue with the rest of the video, I need to just make a small little adjustment here. Since Ace Combat 3 consists of multiple discs, and with the way that Duckstation works, each disc will get its own memory card file that's completely separate from each other. And I believe that this may lead into the issue where if you're playing on disc 1, and you get to the point where you need to swap over to disc 2, disc 2 won't be able to read the first disc's memory card to carry the progress of the game over, and then you're just gonna get stuck there. There's an easy fix for it though. Just go to settings, then down to memory card settings, and at the top here, click this drop down and select shared between all games. What this will do is make a memory card file that will contain all of your game saves. And so both the first and second discs of Ace Combat will be able to read from the same save file. I'm not sure if that is actually an issue. I haven't gotten a chance to actually properly test it out, but rather do this just to be safe and not have any issues. Just a quick tip before you launch any of the games, emulators tend to be very loud for some reason. They just love blasting so much audio through your speakers or your headset that you will literally just go deaf. If you want to turn down the audio levels before you actually play the games, just head to settings, audio settings, and turn the output volume down to about 50% or whatever your preference may be. Do the same for fast forward volume. I find 50% is plenty loud when you turn up your Windows audio level, while not being deafeningly loud that will actually damage your ears. To launch a game, just double click on it. Note though that launching a game for the first time, or changing some of the enhancement settings, will have Duckstation recompile its shaders, which can take a little bit of time. And when it's done, the game will start. There you go. You can then toggle full screen by pressing the Alt and Enter buttons on your keyboard. You can then press the Alt and Enter key again to exit full screen mode. If you'd prefer the games to launch in full screen immediately, then you can go to settings, and under general settings, check this setting here, start in full screen. Also, If you don't want to see the PlayStation 1 boot up sequence every single time you run a game, you can just right click on the game you want to play and then select fast boot. It'll skip the boot sequence of the PlayStation 1 and goes directly to the game. Or alternatively, you can go to settings, go to BIOS settings and check this option here to enable fast boot all the time. When you play Air Combat for the first time, it will default to novice controls, which are kinda just terrible and very clunky. I wouldn't really recommend playing the game like this. What I would recommend is switching to expert controls, so you have full control over your aircraft. To do this, in the main menu, go to Option, Key Configuration, then press up and then up again to switch to expert mode. You can then just press down and then exit. Also, when you're on this screen, to save the game or to go back to the title screen, press the select button to open this menu, where you can then either save the game, load the game, or go back to the title screen. The same is the case for Ace Combat 2. Just go to Options, Key Config, and then scroll down and press right to set it to Expert Controls, and then you can just exit. While playing Ace Combat 3, at some point you'll have to swap from the one disc to the other disc, and you'll be presented with this screen. It's pretty easy though. You just click on the change disc button at the top, select from game list, and then just double click on the other disc. It should pick up that you swapped the discs and start loading the game, so you can continue. Another quick little tip for Ace Combat 3 that I actually didn't know until getting really far into my first playthrough of the game is that when you have all of your save files already occupied, you finish the game, you only have a sim mode. How can you then restart one of the campaigns? All you do is press once more right, and you get the option for new file. It doesn't actually work when you scroll left, it just skips it. It only works when you scroll right. And we are done. Now you can go play the 3 original Ace Combat games on your PC with the best possible graphics quality. I hope you found this guide helpful. This is only part 1 of my full comprehensive emulation guide for all Ace Combat games, at least the ones that are worthwhile and that you can emulate on PC. The next part of my guide will cover the 3 PlayStation 2 games, also known as the Holy Trinity: Ace Combat 4 Shattered Skies, Ace Combat 5 The Unsung War, and Ace Combat 0 The Balkan War. But until next time, cheerio!